Sherkin, lovely. Okay. Okay, we're live.
Hello.
Oh, are you there? Hello.
Hello, I can see you. Hello.
Adrian, this is Glenn coming now. You're up on a big screen behind us and there's an audience.
Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Can you see me?
It bounces backwards and forwards. Glenn, are you okay?
Hey, Glenn.
Hey, John.
How you doing?
Good. What? So.
You still need to move it.
So.
Can you see me?
Yeah. Is it going to bounce back and forward? Is that how?
I think it's probably going to bounce back between the two of you. Let's go into settings. Now, you don't see us.
Maybe switch the other one on. Yeah, there we go. Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're good.
Okay, I'm just going to get your slides up then, John.
Huh?
I'm just going to get your slides up then, and then we're ready to go.
Are you able to click through the sides for me, Glenn?
Sure.
Excellent. Excellent. Cool. How's the day going?
Really good. We started with a few technical glitches in the beginning, just with the tannoy system. It didn't really work, so we had to go old style and just speak. So yeah, everything is going good, and we'll be ready to go. Yeah, by time.
Yeah, that's...
Glenn?
Yes?
As much as I'm enjoying looking at you, is there any chance I can see the audience? Hello, that's much better. I feel like I'm actually talking to. Yeah, hello. You're all kind of just shadows, but that's okay. There we go.
There's a bit better there. Okay.
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 You having a good day, everyone?
Yes.
Yeah, I bet you are. Sounds awesome.
Okay, well, we're going to just jump right into it then, because
Yeah, no worries.
it's really tight and we're moving with the tide, and so everybody has been given the PDFs. Everybody has got the biogs. I'd just like to say that John is one of the leading academics writing on island life, island governance, and island studies. And he's very much, a lot of his writing and a lot of his work is used in the course, on the BABA course. And a lot of the use of his work has led to some of the structure of the project and the ideas around this particular project. So initially, John really wanted to come over, but he wasn't able to come over. He's going to come next time. And so this time we just figured we would set up a Skype discussion or a Skype presentation. So I'm really delighted to have John present on this particular subject, island relation in the Anthropocene.
So it's really nice. Can I go back to see everyone again, if that's okay? Because it's a bit strange otherwise. Thank you. Hi, everyone again. Okay, so can you hear me okay, yeah? Awesome. Okay, so I've been told you're public, but I don't ever really know what public means. So I'm gonna kind of just talk about a couple of things over the next 20-30 minutes or so. Could you put it onto slide 2, please, Glenn? Can you see that okay?
Done.
Yeah?
Yep, all good.
Awesome. So I'm just going to say a couple of things, really. The first thing is that islands aren't really ever isolated. That might be a relatively obvious thing to say, but as Glenn said, I'm an academic, and academics move in trends and phases, and particularly in island studies at the moment, there's a really strong emphasis upon islands not as this kind of stereotyping of insular, isolated, Robinson Crusoe type things, but actually islands is very kind of connected, part of relations, movements, mobilities, and flows, and so on. So that's been variously called the relational turn in island studies that's gone on over the last few decades. So I'm going to talk a bit about that, and then I'm going to talk about something that's, as you would imagine, very important for island studies. But often islands get used as laboratories when it comes to things like global warming and this thing called the Anthropocene that we'll talk about a bit later. And I want to kind of talk about how the Anthropocene and things like global warming, the idea that humans have transformed the planet, what that does to how we reconceptualize and rethink island relations. So those are the two things I'm gonna do in this talk. Hopefully that's reasonably straightforward. Could you put onto slide 3, please, Glenn?
Done.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is an ultimately cliched thing to start off with, but why not? Hey, it's often said that the human mind not only thinks about islands but with them. But if this is the case, then like the human mind, we actually have quite a lot of trouble when it comes down to it, thinking about islands as completely isolated and cut off from the rest of the world. So John Donne's very famous metaphysical wit that always throws juxtapositions of metaphors. No man is an island entire of itself. I won't read it all, but you've got it there, and it's a very famous illustration of challenging or throwing into question the idea that islands are completely isolated. Another famous short story, I don't know if you know this or not, but I'd advise you to have a little look and read it, is D.H. Lawrence's The Man Who Loved Islands. It's a lovely short story, and it's about a man who wants to get away onto an island of his own, a world of his own, yeah? And he goes through various stages, and he keeps trying to build this island and escape more and more into a world of his own, and in the end he just doesn't manage to achieve it. And so just to illustrate that, the first sentence says, "There was a man who loved islands. He was born on one, but it didn't suit him, as there were too many other people on it besides himself. He wanted an island all of his own, not necessarily to be alone on it, but to make it a world of his own. But as I say, in the end, he tries to do all these things, keep escaping to one island and then going to another and another. And in the end, the final sentence that D.H. Lawrence says is, as he looked, the sky mysteriously darkened and chilled. From far off came the mutter of unsatisfied thunder, and he knew it was the signal of the snow rolling over the sea. He turned and felt its breath on him." And I think that's quite a nice thing. I'm not going to be talking about the Anthropocene and global warming just yet, but the idea that islands are just not isolated. We're all somehow embedded in roots and relations and so on, and that's particularly so when it comes to the Anthropocene. So if we could just turn to slide 4, please, Glenn.
Yeah.
Okay, so as I said, island scholarship, like all scholarship, moves in phases, broader shifts and trends in debate. Today, island scholarship, as I mentioned earlier, increasingly goes against narrow stereotypes of island insularity, isolation and disconnection. And instead, it foregrounds how islands are intricately bound up in relations, networks, interconnections and flows. Now, in some ways, we can just simply call attention to facts to illustrate this point, that islands are part of interconnected island chains, interrelations, movements and archipelagos. Most obviously, where I work is the Caribbean, or there's New Zealand, or Indonesia, or the Aegean. These are all archipelagos of islands and not isolated islands. You could also talk about historical archipelagos too, the Phoenician network, which is incredibly sophisticated, of trade routes that was built around merchant cities, or the Minoan civilization, or the Republic of Venice in the Middle Ages, or the strategic locations of the British Empire, just to name a few. It's just a factual point that islands are very interconnected. Yeah, we could also point to how the UK has 6,000 islands on it. Ireland, I don't know how many islands you have there. I couldn't find out the exact figure. It seemed to go, but apparently there's someone called David Walsh, who I don't know if he's there or not, has visited 503 of these islands. Canada too isn't a unitary single mass, but it's composed of 30,000 islands, which means that Canada is really more of an archipelago of interconnected islands than a solid continent. Australia also has 8,000 islands, perhaps 12,000 islands if you include islands and islets and rocky outcrops. And the Pacific, someone called Epio Hoefer has said it's not very useful to think of the Pacific as an ocean region as such. It's better to think of it as a sea of islands. It has 25,000 islands on it. And as my little 5-year-old girl will know, watching Moana, which may not be the most historically accurate program from Disney, it's nevertheless about island-island relations. And one of my favorite little pithy phrases is from Alfred Russel Wallace when he was doing the Malay archipelago explorations. He said, "Islands do Asia." So what that does is just point to the fact that islands really are often part of archipelagos and interconnected relations. Indeed, there's a lot of work at the moment in island studies that's talking about how we actually live in an archipelagic world. So there's a nice recent book that's just come out from Duke University Press by my friends Brian Roberts and Michelle Stevens, called Archipelagic Americas. And they point to how, despite what Trump may be thinking, the Americas has always been archipelagic. It's always been about connections and archipelagic connections. From the first American novel, if you think about Huckleberry Finn, it's an archipelagic journey, yeah, down the Mississippi Islands. But also just on a kind of more obvious level, the American reaches out into the Pacific and the Atlantic, Puerto Rico, the Marshall Islands, Northern Maria Islands, Guam, which has been in the press recently, the Caribbean, Hawaii, New Zealand, and Canada, in ongoing movements of people, power, and geopolitics. And now through to the massive garbage islands that are emerging in the Pacific as a part of island and continental relations from America, but all of us more generally. So in many ways, people are also producers of islands and archipelagic relations as well. Most obviously the icebergs at the moment that are being directly affected by global warming. But also there's a massive program at the moment about building human archipelagic islands and island relations, such as wind farms or the islands that are being built in the South China Sea, and massive floating military islands. And there's some images there on slide 4. Have you got that in front of you? Yes. Yeah. So what I'm really trying to just say by those factual points is that most islands and certainly most continents are intricately interconnected into often thousands of connections and island relations. Even when it comes to things like SIDS, which is a very well-known acronym, Small Island Developing States, you know, these pictures of the Maldives disappearing underwater. Was that so? Sorry, I didn't get that.
It's also an acronym for Sherkin Island Development Society.
Ah, okay. Well, maybe this is true as well then. This may be true or not. It's actually a multi-island polity. So if you think about the Maldives or those kind of islands, they're actually archipelagic relations and networks. Yeah. So even this idea of the solitary island disappearing over global warming, they're often part of island connections and flows. So that's kind of the more factual stuff, I guess, about just making that point. And there's a lot of research. It's very part of this relational turn in island studies that's going on, exploring all those island interconnections. Can you just turn to slide 5, please, Glenn?
Yep.
But what I think this often works at, this kind of relational thinking about islands, is often more at the psychological level, yeah, as much as the kind of practical, factual level about geopolitics and relations and global warming and things. And as I say, I work in the Caribbean. I've worked there for about 20 years. So that's kind of where I engage with the relational thinking in islands. And there's a well-known poet from Barbados called Camus Brathwaite, who invokes really well this idea that island psychology in the Caribbean is different from the kind of imperial, imported Western psychology. So what Brathwaite says is, why is our psychology not dialectical or successfully dialectical in the way that Western philosophy has assumed? But he comes up with this phrase, which is a lovely phrase, dialectic, like the coming from one continent and continuum, touching another, and then receding from the island into perhaps the creative chaos of the Caribbean's future. Now, when Brathwaite's talking about this, he's obviously talking about the histories of slavery and the ships and the movements and how that's created a dialectic consciousness in the Caribbean. So that idea that islands in the Caribbean, these things that were considered so peripheral to the world, are very centrally dialectic. And it's probably important to point out that for most of those 400 years of Caribbean history, it was actually the Caribbean that was the center, and North America was this peripheral thing that was just somewhere over there that no one knew anything about. Yeah. So it's just the kind of idea of a different psychology that's of relational thinking in island studies. Could you just flip to number 6 slide, please, Glenn?
Yep.
And again, sticking with that kind of Caribbean theme, Edward Glissant, who is, if you ever want to kind of go into this relational thinking in island studies in more depth, is a really central character. In a book called The Poetics of Relation, it's a pretty heavy, dense text, as you can tell by these kind of quotes, but I think it's just worth calling this up a bit. So what Glissant says is, when he walks on a beach in Martinique and he looks out to St. Lucia, he says, I've always imagined that these depths navigate a path between the sea in the west and the ocean in the east, and that though we are separated, each in our plantation, the now green balls and change, that's obviously the slavery he's talking about there, have rolled beneath from one island to the next, weaving shared rivers that we shall open up when it is our time, and where we shall take our boats. From where I stand, I see St. Lucia on the horizon, and step by step I call up the expanse of the relation. So what Brathwaite and Glissant are doing there, and I acknowledge it's very dense prose, but they're talking about a different psychology, a dialectic psychology, a relational psychology of island life in the Caribbean. Could you just flick to slide 7, please, Glenn?
Yeah.
Now, I think a really nice illustration of this is something that I've studied quite a lot in Barbados. It's called the landship. Are you able to put up the YouTube video there, Glenn?
Give it a shot.
You might need to cut and paste.
Cut and paste the wrong thing. 1 second, no, just give me 1 second.
No, if you can't do it, it doesn't matter.
Good to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how long is this?
You don't have to watch the whole thing. Is it started or?
So I'll just put it on full screen real quick and maybe a minute.
Just watch this for a minute or so. This is a dance and social welfare institution in Barbados called the Landship. And you can laugh. It's okay. They laugh too. You don't have to be.
Right forward. Right up 5 anywhere. Platoon. Right as the word for it, right to left
to interrupt because I know Glenn's wants to get this down on time. Has anyone ever seen that before or heard of it? No? Okay. So I know you were talking about boats earlier. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is a land ship. Okay. Now, this is continuing that idea that the psychology of Barbados and Caribbean islands is very much dialectic. Yeah. It's about engaging in what happened on the sea and bringing it onto land. Okay. And they're fully connected to these kind of island networks and relations. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the land ship. It's a fascinating thing. So the land ship is a dance, but it was also a social welfare institution. It's kind of unique to Barbados, but a lot of Caribbean islands have these similar types of things. Now, what was important about the land ship is no one really knows where it came from. It may have come from the 1840s, 50s, or so on, but it played a particularly important role in Barbados history around the time of after emancipation and into independence. As many of you may know, when slavery was abolished in the Caribbean, it was the slave owners that were compensated for their troubles, but not the slaves. So they didn't have any social welfare or anything like that. So they had to come up with their own ways in which they could generate money, put it into a collective pot, and then, you know, dish it out to people that were having hardship and trouble. So these were early social welfare organizations in the Caribbean. And the land ship was very important, as I say, 19th century, early 20th century, where land ships of the thing you can see of various sizes took part in all the different parishes. There's 11 parishes in Barbados, and it took part in all of them. And the land ship evolved through complex island, sea, and land relations over history. It kind of gives it away in the title. It's called a land ship, yeah? So the land ship forms relations that have taken board on ships over time, over history, and then reweaves them into a dance that now takes place in the land ship. Okay, and what's important here is on the land ship performance, such as the brief clip you saw there, is you're talking about activities that took place on slave ships, but also on steamships as they arrived into the Caribbean in 1824, and various other things. And you heard the tuck music, yeah, which comes from a mixture of Scotland, Ireland, bit of Africa, and so on, gets weaved into one thing, yeah? That tuck music is actually the rhythm of the steamship, yeah, building up. And as the land ship gets faster and faster, as that, if you'd have watched that video, it reaches full steam, yeah? And the land ship does things like, some of the moves are called like the wangle low. And I don't know if you know where the limbo comes from. The limbo, you know, when you limbo down under things. That's from where slaves on slave ships were forced to get under, because they only had a couple of feet, and they have to go under. So the limbo is a reenactment of what they did on slave ships, as is the wangle low on the land ship. So the land ship, and I'm not going to, you know, I could go on and on about it because it's a very fascinating institution. It just weaves these dialectically, as Braithwaite would say, these kind of relations that have taken place over history into the island form, into this thing that is unique to Barbados. So different land ships, such as the one you saw there as an example of one land ship, they're called things like the Rodney, the Iron Duke, the Naval Victory, the Queen Mary, and the Nelson. And different characters on it are called the Lord High Admiral, the Captain, the Boatsman, the Quartermaster, the Doctor, the Matron, the Engineer, and so on. And no one's allowed to stop their different moves, which are called things like the rough seas and hauling the anchor, until the ranking naval officers pipe them off deck. Yeah. So really, what I've just been saying so far in the talk is that factually you can see island relations as connected, and that many continents we think of as these solid land masses like Canada have 30,000 islands, really making it an archipelago. But also psychologically, island life is about this coming to consciousness in relation, such as the land ship. So if you just flick to slide 8, please there, Glenn.
Yeah.
As Godfrey Baldacchino kind of sums up where I think debate is very much at in island studies at the moment, islands are part of complex and cross-cutting systems of regional and global interaction. So that was the simple first point I wanted to make, just by way of those different examples, that the islands are relational spaces, that we try and often think about them as isolated, but it's almost impossible when you delve into island culture, community, consciousness, and so on. Okay, so that's the first thing, and it's I think very much where debate is at. The second thing I wanted to talk about, if you could put it onto slide 9, please, Glenn. Yeah. Is this thing called the Anthropocene. As I said at the beginning of the talk, the human mind finds it very difficult to think about islands in isolation. And if we think about islands, we also think with them. And I think nowhere is this more obvious today than when we think about how the island has become so symbolic of this thing called the Anthropocene. This new era where across our TV screens and social media feeds, we see islands as impacted by global warming, hurricanes, and sea level rises. Now, 10 years ago, when I told my mates, oh, I do island studies, they'd be like, what the hell are you doing that? That's a career suicide. Now, everyone wants to talk about islands because these are the emblematic symbols of where it's all going kaput. Yeah. And, you know, it's a kind of throwaway remark, and it's a cheap remark, but I think it's just true as well. Yeah. Island consciousness is part of this. And as so often in history, the figure of the island gets picked up and reused in different ways. And, you know, you just think about the hurricanes that hit the Caribbean recently, or Puerto Rico and so on. The island has become symbolic. It's the absolute symbolic figure of our changing global climate. Greek myth tells us that Zeus did not want man to have fire. But Prometheus, who helped create man, did give man fire. Zeus said to Prometheus, you can't give man fire. If man has fire, he will rise up against the gods and take over the planet. But Prometheus didn't listen. And so Prometheus was banished to an island in the Caucasus by Zeus for doing so. And because Prometheus was an immortal, Zeus couldn't kill him. So every day he sent down an eagle to peck out Prometheus's liver. And every night Prometheus's liver grew back. And then the next day, the same thing happened for eons until Hercules rescued him. But the point is, Zeus was right. Man has had fire. And the result is that the gods have been, the Greek gods anyway, have been relegated to antiquity. And we now potentially live in this new epoch called the Anthropocene, where humans have become a new geological, atmospheric, chemical, biological, and hydrological force. Yeah. At the moment, no one's formally designated it the Anthropocene. Lots of scientists and Nobel Prize winners have made the argument that it's there. We've ticked all the boxes. We're now in a new epoch. Present, we're in this thing called the Holocene. It's been around for about 16,000, 18,000 years. But the argument is that we are now this new force that has transformed the planet. Humans are such a force that the planet itself is changing. And global warming is a good example of that. But nuclear fallout is the same as well. There's been over 2,056 detonations since the Manhattan bomb in 1945 was first detonated. The planet has transformed as a result. Nuclear radiation has encircled the Earth. We have ticked all the little boxes that scientists and the Royal Geographical Society say you have to tick to go into a new epoch. And it won't be long before we're now formally in that new epoch, I'm pretty sure. Okay, so that is that slide that you're seeing there, the kind of epochs, and now that we're kind of in the Anthropocene. As the Economist article says, welcome to the Anthropocene. Now, from an island studies perspective, a key point here is that today's boundary respecting phenomenon, like global warming, nuclear plumes, atmospheric and oceanic pollutions, increasingly make a mockery out of the idea that there could be some idea of a pure nature, a wilderness, or an isolated or sealed off island somewhere over there in the middle of the Pacific or in the Arctic or whatever that hasn't been transformed or changed as a result of the Anthropocene. At the most recent Islands of the World conference, which was in Holland a couple of weeks ago, we went to Terschelling Island, which is a UNESCO site, a nature reserve. And the ecologist stood on there and he made a really, I think, important point, which was this: we're calling this a nature island and it's bounded. But in the Anthropocene, in things like global warming, there is no area of this island that hasn't been touched by pollutants of some sort, atmospheric, oceanic, plastics, and so on. So it becomes increasingly problematic to think of islands as these sealed off places of nature. And as I say, a key example of this is global warming. Many people say you can date the Anthropocene to a particular year, 1784, when James Watt invented the steam engine, and from then on, carbon and coal-fired industries began to be deposited worldwide, with the resulting global warming we have today. And this does weird things to how we think about island relations. As you remember from the first half of the talk I was saying, it was very spatial what we were talking about. We were talking about archipelagos and networks and flows and the Caribbean kind of networks, yeah, or the Canada being about opened out spatially, yeah. But the Anthropocene does weird stuff to how we think about island relations, because all islands of the world are already within, or better inside, global warming. There's no outside to global warming. There's no escape. It's probably why we've got so into science fiction at the moment. How do you escape? It's called global for a reason, yeah? But what's also weird about global warming is it doesn't unfold all at once, but rather through many different times, some extremely slow and taking place over hundreds of millennia, others having a more sudden an impact and violence. So if we take, for example, somewhere like the Caribbean that was hit by hurricanes recently, yeah? You've got various temporalities playing out, and this does weird things to how you think about islands. You've got the non-linear time of global climate change that is brought about by the Earth's ellipsis around the sun and massive global carbon emissions as they shape and work into islands' ecosystems. You've got the slow decompositional time of carbon decomposing from global warming and carbon emissions that takes about 100,000 years in the ocean. And then you've got these sudden violent times and eruptions like El Nino events or monsoons or more intensive hurricanes that hit the island perhaps immediately. But even if they're not hitting your island, they're shaping the temporal rhythms of society and economy around the world. So what kind of this does is weird things to how we think about island relations. And I think that's very much where a lot of island scholars are trying to think through at the moment. We were previously focused very much upon how islands are part of archipelagos and networks and connections. But now we're trying to rethink through islands in terms of this weird stuff that the Anthropocene does in terms of these very slow, long times and these kind of very immediate times of sudden impacts of hurricanes and things like that associated with global warming. So I'm just going to say one more thing about this in terms of where the politics of all this is heading, and something that deeply concerns me today when it comes to the politics of islands within the Anthropocene and global warming and things like that. Over history, the island has been romanticized, yeah? You read any novel from Homer to Defoe to you know, Robinson Crusoe and so on. You know, it's this kind of thing that you can play with and so on. And you're going to have to bear with me on this, but the thing I want to say is that the island is once again being romanticized as a figure of global warming. And in particular, Indigenous islanders are being celebrated for their resilience. Now, Indigenous islanders in the Pacific or you know, the Atlantic or wherever, islanders are resilient. They're tough and strong people. Don't get me wrong, yeah? But the point I want to make about this is this suits powerful people, because Trump is, and a lot of other people in powerful nations are going with the idea that these kind of indigenous Maoris or whatever are strong and resilient and more attuned with the environment, which a lot of kind of people are also celebrating from an anti-colonial perspective, yeah? But in a weird way, what's happening is that the figure of the Indigenous Islander is more attuned to nature, more in tune to the environment that fits into this whole new era we're talking about, can be, and I know it's a controversial point I'm making, can also be deeply problematic. Because as my friends in the Caribbean say, when they're celebrated as the indigenous subject, well, that's great then. So you're saying we've got to be resilient and it's over to us to deal with this stuff, when most of the pollution's coming from America or Europe or whatever. So if you could just put it to the slide 11 there, Glenn, this is my final one. after Puerto Rico, a lot of people started reusing this banner, which was used after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in America before. And it's kind of true. You know, there's a weird thing going on where we're celebrating Islanders' resilience and the indigeneity of it and all that. But it's like, you know, every time you say I'm resilient, you can do something else to me. So I think that's a dominant theme within the politics of islands in the Anthropocene, but I think it's potentially worrying as well. So just to sum up what I've kind of said then, and I've used lots of different examples, but I've only really said two things. The first thing was that islands aren't isolated, and the islands are part of relations and networks and flows and so on, and that shapes island psychology and so forth. And the second thing is that islands have emerged as this figure of the Anthropocene, which is doing weird things to how we think about island relations. And within that, I find this troubling concern with islanders' resilience, because islanders are resilient, it's true, but there's a tension playing out there. And as I say, my friends in the Caribbean, government officials there and so on are like, we're getting a bit worried about this idea of it's all down to us to become resilient and deal with this stuff. That's where the money is, yeah? So that's it. So thank you for listening.
John, thank you very much. I really appreciate the time and the focus that you put in to the presentation. I think we're going to have to utilize the land ship to get from here to the boat.
You've got to do the dance. You know how to do it now.
We have a few minutes for questions, and there's a lot of islanders in the room, so I just think it's really important that we,
cool,
very least, allow people to speak back to you. So, anybody have any questions on the presentation? On what's been said? Good, bad, agree, disagree? Yes.
Oh, sorry, Glenn, I can't hear, man.
You can come over. It'd be nice for him to see somebody else instead of the hall. Literally, if you come right here, you can have a chat with him. Here you go, right there. Yeah.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
Hello. I was just wondering, is that idea of resilience, you talked about it in a essentially negative way.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any conversation going on in terms of the island resilience in a positive way with a mainland discourse, as it were? Is there that conversation going on? Because I think that idea of islands teaching the mainland is wonderful, because I mean they are kind of microcosms of what goes on everywhere.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you had anything to say on that.
No, I think most of the talk about resilience is positive. You know, I think I'm definitely, you know, there's the point I was making there is absolutely controversial, yeah. You know, but it's always nice to end the talk on a controversial point. I mean, I think most resilient, I mean, why would you not want to be resilient? Yeah. You know, I mean, like my little 5-year-old kid, you know, she gets taught how to be resilient in school classes. You know, if our workload's too high at the uni, they don't give us less work. They teach us how to be resilient. Yeah. And I think that islanders have so much to teach people. That's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that there is a danger of falling into a trap in over celebrating the resilience of islanders when the problems are much more interconnected and much more global, and that the political horizons of resilience may not be enough. That's what I'm saying when it comes to things like global warming. Just getting by and just adapting and just adjusting may not be enough. You know what I mean? So I'm not denying anything you're saying. I completely agree with you. And I do projects and work where people from the Caribbean come over and teach continental, you know, Europeans how to do things much better. So I completely agree with you. I just think there's a bit of a trap that a lot of, if I could put this in a nice way, politically correct people want to say, which is that, you know, we've got to celebrate the indigeneity and the resilience of these islanders, and damn, you should. Yeah, you really should. You know, the Caribbean has been oppressed for centuries and reduced to nothing. But I think, in the weird thing that's happening here is could be a lot of powerful people who are going, great, they can deal with it. They're tough, yeah, and they adapt, and they're in touch with the atmosphere and the world, and you know what I mean. That was my point.
Yes, no.
Thank you very much, though.
John, we have time for more questions, if anybody has one. No? Yes?
Sorry, I couldn't hear that.
You'll have to come up, Bridget. This is Bridget, who's living on the island.
Hi, Bridget.
I'll just say, as an example,
Or
perhaps if we didn't have to put so much energy into being resilient on islands, we might have more energy to put into other things. As an example, the art course here, don't have to put
I agree.
into getting funding for the course, then we wouldn't waste the time applying for the funding every year if we weren't expected to be so resilient.
I completely agree. I completely agree. I mean, I think one of the things that I see, I was chatting to Glenn, I think it was last week, and a lot of things is, I think a lot of it's about trying to create island networks maybe as well, which I think is what you're trying to do in some way, yeah? So that the capacity increases. I think that's extremely important. And that's the positive from everything I was talking about. Islands are groovy at the moment. Islands tick funders' boxes, yeah? And I think that island networks can tap into this. But what worries me is that there's a narrow way of framing the funding, if that makes sense, yeah? That it's just about trying to get by and the resilience side of it, and that there's so more positive higher horizons that island networks could engage rather than playing into that kind of reductive thing, yeah? So I think for me, I think islands talking to islands is the key to try and develop the capacity as much as islands talking to mainlands as well, if that makes sense. So I've been involved with a cross-island union development of fisher people in the Caribbean, where different islands talk to each other, and fisher people who've never left their island meet other fisher people across the Eastern Caribbean and so on, and try and develop those inter-island union relations as well. So, but I totally agree, it's tough, you know, but it sounds like you've got a lot of people there.
Yes, and in many ways, what you've just talked about links into the next talk, which is going to look at the relationship between islands and imaginative capacities. So,
oh, brilliant!
Beyond the survivalist instinct of resilience, what kind of imaginary or political imaginaries can we develop through island cultures? So, on that note, we're going to have to land ship out of here. It was really great to hear the talk. I really would love to have you come over next time and give it in person or something along those lines. So maybe we can work on that for the next year.
No worries, Glenn. Thank you very much. I enjoyed that. Okay, cheers, man. Thanks a lot. Have fun this afternoon.
Will do. Cheers. See you.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, folks, out this door.
Who's the captain? Jonah Culver is going to be the captain. Follow John.
Follow Fiona. Where's Fiona?
Fiona? You go. You go. Good. Good.
Okay, we have three. I'm going down.